Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, we say goodbye as the Mets 2022 season comes to an end as they drop Game 3 to the San Diego Padres in the wild card round. It's time for a little therapy, or a lot of therapy, from Joe and I as we go into what went wrong, what needs to be fixed, and there will be a long offseason of that, and of course, what's ahead as our show goes nowhere. We will be here the entire offseason with you. So a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, and it is by far the saddest episode of the Mets Pod, as the Mets dropped Game 3 in the wild card round of the San Diego Padres, and what was once an incredible season comes to a bit of a shocking, abrupt end in Queens. So, Joe, I'll waste no time. I'll bring you in here because this is going to be a Connor and Joe special today and nothing else. Of course, we will take mailbag questions at the end of the show because the listeners are a big a part of this show as you and I are, but we're going to go pretty therapy heavy here, man. I would just like your kind of initial reaction, because we surprisingly have not discussed this too much as the Mets are bounced early from the postseason.
Sports are pain. Like, it's one of those things that I think if you listen to this show, you follow me on Twitter, all that stuff, you know, there's the supremely negative fans, there's the supremely positive fans. You kind of know where I reside on that spectrum. And it just felt like such a disappointment, such a letdown. And, sports are just pain. Like, at the end of the day, you think about it, and it's just like, for 6 months, day in and day out, we watched this team. And make no mistake about it, for 5.5 months of that at least, it was consistent, great, wonderful baseball that we thoroughly enjoyed watching, covering, all that stuff. The reality is, in sports, the playoffs are the playoffs, and only one team gets to be happy. Only one fan base gets to be happy. I'm waiting for the day that fan base is us. I've been waiting my entire life, and it really did feel like this Mets team had the ingredients of a team that can make a deep run into October, into November, and I it's all over getting ripped now. But my prediction for SNY was that the Mets would win the World Series, and I didn't do that just to be a homer. I'm sure there was some bias and homerism in there, but I truly believe that Jacob deGrom, Max Scherzer, and Chris Bassett would lead this team to where it needed to be with Edwin Diaz at the end of the games, and they would get enough offense. The offense is not the strongest part of this team. The pitching is. The pitching failed them over the end of the season. You go to the Atlanta series, they set everything up perfectly to have their three best against Atlanta, needing to win one game, and none of the pitchers showed up. The offense didn't show up either, but you didn't show up there, and now you come to the wild card game, and Max Scherzer, you could not have convinced me that Max Scherzer was going to give up 7 runs and 4 home runs in game 1 of the wild card. And, Jacob deGrom did his thing game 2. The bats did enough game 2. And then, obviously, game 3, we're going to get into game 3 here. But, Bassett didn't do great. And the offense completely and utterly no-showed, which is something that we saw kind of sporadically throughout September. And yeah, it's just really tough to think after all this, it's over after a weekend. But man, that's sports for you. And I guess if you want I'm not positive spinning anything. I think it's clear my level of disappointment. But it's just one of those things that, man, I don't know. I actually don't know what to say. It's tough.
I'm glad you ended it that way, because that's been my biggest take throughout all of this, is that I have not been able to process the end of this season traditionally like I usually can. And it's not just in baseball. I've obviously covered plenty of different New York Jets seasons. I'm a huge Rangers fan. Obviously, we live and die with the Mets. And in 2006, it felt like heartbreak, right? Like truly heartbreak. And In 2015, it was, wow, what a flash in the pan. It was a fun ride. It felt like they had some magic at the right time. But when they ran into a better club in the World Series, you can swallow that and be like, you know what? They weren't the most talented team in the World Series. They weren't even close to the most talented team in the playoffs that year. They just got hot at the right time. And this year was so much different than that because this is our first year doing the Mets pod here at SNY, and they made it so easy for us to talk about them each week. They never lost more than 3 games in a row. I think they got swept twice, and it was both in September. This team was fun to watch, and this team gave you incredible memories and moments of joy for a long period of time right out of the gate of the season that when they started to run out of gas in September, you always still believed in them that they would get it back, right? No matter how much DeGrom was fighting through a couple starts, or Scherzer didn't always look like himself, or the DH positions and the acquisitions they made, especially Darren Ruff, the righty side of it, didn't produce, and that they didn't get the spark from their young players, really out of some bad luck, some decision making, right? Beatty got hurt, Alvarez was brought up too late, and that's a conversation for probably another day. But the bottom line was, in the back of your mind, you're like, they'll figure it out because they're a veteran team. We've seen Max Scherzer in the postseason a million times. Credit to DeGrom. DeGrom did figure it out, and DeGrom came up big when they needed him. Was it a vintage Jacob DeGrom, nobody can touch him night? No, but DeGrom got them 6 innings of 2-run ball, and while he wasn't perfect, he was really, really good, and the offense fed off of that and picked him up as well. So it's been really difficult to process because of all the joy of a 100-plus win season, of how much better things got. They won 77 games in 2021, and they fell on their face in the second half. And this team felt so much different. And to credit, this team was a lot different. But when it got to the end of the season, and I'm not talking about the best of 3 wildcard series, which was the pinnacle of all of this. And I'm not talking about going down to Atlanta and getting swept, but getting swept by the Cubs, losing a series to the Nationals, things that could have made your life so much easier in the long run, they didn't get it done. And there's no going back. And something that you and I are going to look to this offseason on plenty of shows, because we are going to do this show, obviously, every single week. It's going to be a crazy offseason for the Mets because we'll tell you right now, Steve Cohen and this management group, they're not just running this back. They have a lot of free agents that are expected to explore other options. They're going to try to get better, and they're going to try to take a significant improvement of the DNA of this team, right? When you look at 2021 and 2022, the DNA of this team drastically improved. You can say that while admitting they also ran out of gas. It's not all or nothing. They got to the position they were in coming off 77 wins to 101 because of those improvements. But now you need to find a way to add a couple new bricks as layers. And it's got to probably be risky. There's going to be some big decisions to be made. But you do have to move forward, as brutal as dealing with this was.
There's a lot of free agents, and like you said, we will get into that. We're going to keep doing this show through the hot stove, through everything, and there could be some changes up in the front office side. Like Billy Epler is safe, that's pretty evident, and he should be. A new team president is coming in. I know Andy Martino reported that a president of baseball operations might not be a priority this fall. It might be a Billy Epler run show. And, the reality is they need to change how this team was put together. It was built on pitching, and it was built on purely offense that'll work counts, put the ball in play. And I will be the first to admit, I thought that was probably the best way to build the offense. I thought it was a sustainable model, something that would not go through big peaks and valleys. And it unfortunately went through those big valleys, like you said, in September, losing 2 out of 3 to the Nationals, getting swept by the Cubs, getting swept by the Braves, and all that, even though it led to 101 wins, which is fantastic, they lost the tiebreak to the Braves because of, they win one Braves game. We're having a different conversation. We're previewing the NLDS after a weekend of just watching the Braves face the Padres. So instead, the Mets are where they are. They got the home field for the 3 games, which should be an advantage. And it didn't work out. And the reality is the starting rotation is largely free. Jacob DeGrom can opt out. Carlos Carrasco has a player option. Carlos Carrasco has a team option. Taijuan Walker has a player option. Chris Bassett can opt out of his end of the mutual option. So there's a lot of change coming in that rotation, and they need to be careful about how they address this going forward because of the age in the rotation. You don't want to be too old on the pitching side, especially with a lack of depth. But let's get back to the weekend. And, really, to me, game one, you and I were there. We met up. And thank you to that one person that walked by and gave the classic, "Hey guys, love the pod," and kept walking.
Didn't break stride.
Yeah, didn't break stride. Greatest encounter there. But when you and I met up before the game, we were juiced up. I think we both said to each other, Max is going to shove tonight. And boy,
life comes at you fast.
Yeah, life comes at you fast. You could not convince me that's where they were going to be at. And, the bats didn't show up either. They had opportunities early in the game with runners on. And, the stat was flashed all over ESPN all weekend about the Mets 0 for whatever with runners in scoring position and 2 outs. Like, they were completely ineffective when it counted. And I think what showed in their lineup was the lack of thump really played a role. You need to have guys, you don't want to build that feast or famine, all or nothing offense, but your only sources of power were Francisco Lindor and Pete Alonso. That's it in the whole lineup. And I think that caught up to them in a situation where they needed to score some runs. You can't expect to always manufacture them against the best pitching. And that's what they were facing this weekend with Yu Darvish. And, they got to Blake Snell, but Joe Musgrove, of
they
course,
hit home
as well.
runs.
Yeah,
In game 2.
yeah, they hit home runs in game 2. So, they need to find a way to get more thump in this lineup, and I think that that was definitely exposed this weekend.
I think that it's going to be interesting to watch the game change, right? As we enter an era where the shifting is severely limited and that teams will get back to manufacturing runs and playing some small ball. But all of that being said does not take away that the Mets have a clear need for power. And what's interesting to me, Joe, about these Mets is all the conversations of what went wrong, right? Was it, a lot of people like to look at the trade deadline and go, Epler didn't do enough. And if you're one of those people that believes that, I don't think you're wrong. I just think it's one of the many steps along the way that did not break right for the Mets. When you look at, they traded for 2 guys that were going to be DHing for them every day, right? Ruff did not hit a single home run. Vogelback hit 6, and you know what? Credit to Vogelback. He did have an 830 OPS. I think Vogelback held up his end of the bargain in that acquisition. But when you acquire Vogelback, he's an extremely limited player because of the fact that when a lefty comes in, he has to come out. And when he's on the base paths in a spot where you need a run, he has to come out. He can't play a position in the field. He's a very one-dimensional player. He did hold up his end of the bargain, but Naquin really, really struggled. Ruff gave them literally nothing. The bullpen, it's hard to really go back and look at it and go, man, they didn't do enough in the bullpen when other problems were so much more severe. The Marte injury didn't help. The Marte injury is not the reason the season kind of started to go in the tank in September. It's one of the reasons. These little things built up to them, Joe. And it goes back to your ultimate point that they didn't have the thump to overcome those little things, right? They didn't have the thump in other places to overcome that they didn't get anything from the DH spot. They didn't have the thump in the lineup that when their most consistent hitting presence outside of Jeff McNeil and Starling Marte got hurt to make up for that run production. And they didn't have the thump to make up for when a guy went out on the mound and wasn't perfect each night. So that's going to be a big talking point of the offseason. Now, the interesting thing with the Mets is there are going to be some internal options besides just the constant talk about the external options. And that kind of goes back to my final closing point on the end of the season is it felt like they were really, really hesitant to bring up Alvarez to get him a lot of work as a catcher. And that was something that you and I agreed with in June, something you and I agreed with in July. It's something you and I agreed with at the start of August, but it felt like it reached a point where it was very clear what this team needed and where this team needed more production and output, and they just held on a little long. It didn't help that he got hurt, but it didn't feel like that was the sole reason anyway from not bringing him up, where the Mets were scared to lean on their younger players And you have to wonder if that's going to be a thought process that has to change in the future.
It definitely felt like they had fear of what Alvarez was going to do behind the plate. And
Until
I
it was
know,
code red.
yeah, until it was code red, they didn't have a choice. But I think they wanted him to get as many catching reps as possible in AAA. And I understand, like it's really tough, right? Because you look at the Braves who won the division, and it just feels like anytime they call up a young player, from the word go, they're good. They're ready to go. They're ready to play. It doesn't matter if they come from AA, AAA, doesn't matter. And the Mets, obviously, Mark Vientos didn't get much of an opportunity and didn't show a ton when he did, but, he flashed here and there, but it was just inconsistent playing time. And it's tough for these young players to step into a situation where they're not playing every day. Put a little extra pressure on yourself when you're in the lineup. But the Alvarez thing, that's one that I think at the time, I didn't feel a need to see Alvarez this year at all. Personally, I wanted to see his player development through, and I understand the need to win right now. But I thought Alvarez needed that development in AAA. Frankly, I might not have called him up at all, especially if the situation was going to be the one time you faced a lefty in the playoffs, you weren't going to put him in the lineup. That certainly warrants some questions as to what the deal was there. But yeah, the lack of confidence in the young players is something that's going to have to change because I don't want to talk too much about the future, but I armchair GM all the time. I do this in June when the Mets are 35 games over 500. I still somehow think about next year. But like, they're going to need these cost control guys ready to play right away, real soon. Because this payroll, they're going to spend plenty of money. Steve Cohen, this front office, you're going to see big money spent. But the reality is you need that guy at catcher, comfortable, ready to go. Frankly, probably opening day of 2023. You need to make a decision about Brett Baty. Is he going to be your third baseman on opening day? Does that mean Eduardo Escobar shifts into kind of a utility infielder role? And then that's kind of like, all right, Luis Guillorme has that role too. So there's some redundancy there at a high price. Or is Baty in AAA waiting for an injury or whatever? But when you have young players that are close to the major leagues, that are, close to ready to play every day, it's tough to call them up so late in the season because the pressure is so much higher to get the immediate results, whereas the Braves call it Michael Harris real early in the year, Vaughn Grissom pretty early in the year, where if they did struggle, which they didn't, but if they did struggle, you had some time for them to work through it and get comfortable. But the Mets are going to have to be willing to commit to these young players as they continue this pursuit of trying to be a sustainable winner, trying to take the Dodgers model. And that requires confidence in your young players that they're going to figure it out despite maybe early struggles.
All right, a reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And, one more thing here, Joe, that it's funny how it was overlooked because they kind of underachieved for a while after the deadline. And this is not an excuse. This doesn't make me feel better, but it's something I find interesting. The Padres were all in this year. The Padres traded for Juan Soto. The Padres traded for Josh Hader. The Padres have an incredible, front three of their rotation. They traded for Josh Bell. They made a lot of different moves. Drury. And it worked out for them in the first round. And you looked on the other side with the Mets that made a ton of win-now moves in the offseason, but did not operate that way at the deadline. And we'll see how it goes for the Padres moving forward. But I did find it interesting after how it really didn't seem to be working in their favor the way they thought it would. A lot of people were like, could they challenge the Dodgers now? And they're going to get that chance in the postseason, but they didn't do that during the regular season. It is something to bring up. And, before we do move on to a lengthy mailbag of plenty of good questions, I kind of wanted to get off my chest that things like that, or walking away from a 3-game series and overreacting or underreacting. I think overreacting, I've had so many people ask me like if Max Scherzer's washed. And I'm like, did you just watch the 23 starts he made during the regular season where it was, statistically one of his best years ever? I think, and what Max did for the team. Yes, Max came up short in his 2 biggest starts of the year, and he's going to have to find a way to bounce back from that next year. Max Scherzer is not my concern 1, 2, or 3 right now for this team. I think my concerns, as we're going to have a lot of conversations about during the offseason, are, what is the plan with Nimmo or replacing Nimmo? What is the plan for how aggressive you are to retain Jacob deGrom and make him a Met for life? I don't even put Diaz on my list of concerns because I think Diaz is the most likely of the internal free agents to come back. But my other one is, how are the young guys going to step in and make this team better that aren't solutions of going out and spending millions of dollars or trading a ton of assets on the problems? So those are my big picture, what I walked away from this series with and said, okay, that sucked, like this, but it will be better. I'm confident in that. Or, man, that was awful, and it's a problem they are going to have to aggressively address in the winter. Big picture, Joe, what were some of yours just from this series with the Padres? And you could even go back to the weekend before in Atlanta.
Big picture was, I mean, frankly, I was going to mention Max. I think that is a good point by you, that he's a guy that I know he kind of said some things to one person in the media and said something different to someone else, where there was one comment he made, I believe it was to Ken Rosenthal, I could be wrong, but I think it was, that when talking about his oblique, he was just like, yeah, this is, something I'm trying to reset for next year. So kind of made it seem like maybe there was a little something there, but then every chance he got with the New York media, it was, I'm fine, I'm not hurt, I understand what happened with my fastball shape and spin, it'll be better next time, and there's not a next time, unfortunately. But like you said, I don't think
Opening
Max...
day is the next time.
Yeah, I don't, unfortunately, but I don't think Max is, like you said, one of the top things. I think how they handle this rotation is going to be a big factor, big picture, because I mentioned earlier in the show who's free agents, and it's not as if they're loaded with young pitching coming from the farm system that's just ready to take over. I mean, David Peterson could slide into a spot, and I think he warranted that. Like, I think he warranted the opportunity to be maybe the number 5 starter as you enter 2023. What is Tyler McGill in 2023? Not sure. The market is interesting for free agent pitching. I know Carlos Rodon is a free agent. Justin Verlander's a free agent as an older guy, but it's not exactly flooded with great mid-rotation options, which is what they're going to need. And then you go to the offensive side, and it's just like, how are they going to change how this team looks with basically everyone under control? Brandon Nimmo and Tyler Naquin and our friend Terrence Gore are the only offensive players that are eligible for free agency. So there's a lot of changes coming, and the whole bullpen's free agents, so they're gonna have to shake that up a bit. So I'm kind of all over the place, and I'm usually not, but just this weekend threw me for a loop. And I think to go to this weekend with San Diego, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the Joe Musgrove situation. I know it's obviously a hot button topic. I thought it was weird. I noticed people on Twitter posting in like the first or second inning pictures of a guy's ear. And just saying that out loud just sounds ridiculous. Silly. Yeah, it sounds ridiculous that we're looking at pictures of someone's ear. Shiniest ear I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
No question about that. I wasn't exactly suspicious. By nature, that's not my way. But I thought the way that it was handled, I think there's two sides to this, but to me, that was probably the first moment this year when Buck Showalter came out of the dugout in the 6th inning, went to the umpires, and basically made them go check Joe Musgrove, check his hand, check his glove, check his belt, check his hat, and then the umpire had to ask for consent to rub his ears, and just this really weird thing that to me was the first time in 2022 that I felt, that's something the Mets would do, is in the middle of a big game, have to send their umpires out. It felt
that's like so Mets to you?
It felt that's so Mets to me, and that was the first time this year. So for all things, that Buck has done, it felt like kind of I hate to say stench, but the stench of previous Mets mistakes were going away, even if it wasn't going to end in a World Series or ultimately what we wanted. To me, it came off poorly. It came off. It definitely reeked of being being desperate in a time where they just weren't touching this guy. And I think Buck had some thoughts that this may shake up Musgrove, but a guy with the swagger and confidence that Joe Musgrove possesses, it felt like it took him to another level, and he looked almost even better after it. So I think they poked the horse at the wrong time, and it wasn't a good look in a series where the Mets didn't show up on the pitching side. DeGrom did on Saturday, but Friday with Max, Sunday with Bassett, and then the bats were, hot and cold, and as cold as could be. They got one hit on Sunday, so that rubbed me the wrong way.
I get it. I think that, number one, it was bizarre, really bizarre. It kind of shocked me that the umps checked the pitchers after the innings, right? That They never even... I mean, think about how often we see in this day and age guys fiddle with their hats or any part of their head in general because of the pitch comm. It's something that I've noticed every game I've watched this year. It's just guys constantly put their head, they're fixing their hats more often because of it. So it's a part of a pitcher that umps look at and notice, and his ears were glistening. And it would have been better if the umps had addressed that in between innings when those checks have become a joke, in my opinion. It doesn't really appear like they do anything at all anymore.
They just rub your fingers and just
if you're going to just take it out of the game. It's not doing anything. If guys want to use stuff, I'm sure there's advantages and ways to do it. Now, on the flip side, I agree with you, Joe, that if it got to that point, it wasn't the best look. The only counter I can say to it is the Padres stepping out in every single pitch for timeouts in the series. And you and I were at the game Friday. Obviously, we saw it nonstop Saturday and Sunday. I'm not one of those people that is, a respect the game or you have to play the game the right way, like whatever that stuff kind of means. But I am someone that thinks there is very poor taste. The amount it was, and you know what? If they were allowed to do it, which they were, keep doing it, right? But the fact that I just don't understand what umpires in baseball really do anymore, if you want me to be honest with you. You're just letting guys step out. You're wondering why the game is so slow. You're in the postseason. The game's going to take 12 hours when you let guys step out in between every single pitch. You can grant them the first time out, but say, hey, next at bat or next pitch, you got to be ready to get in the box and go. We're not doing this all night. They didn't do that once the entire series. And guess what? Good for the Padres because they got away with it and they were allowed to do it. I just look at baseball, and this year more than ever, there was countless games every single week that the game got stopped because they couldn't figure out something, that half the time Buck knew more than them. 2, they have no consistent strike zone. I don't care if you call an outside ball a strike, but do it all night. Don't do it in the 3rd inning, and then when the game's on the line in the 7th or 8th inning, not do it. And then in the playoffs, they looked entirely in over their heads. Just how long the Musgrove situation took. They're out there talking for 10 minutes, then they touch his ears, then they talk for another 7 minutes. And you know what? Buck absolutely incited all of that and deserves the criticism that goes his way for the people that think it's a bad look. But my follow-up to all of that is the umps have no control of the game and look poorly prepared. And I'm not saying that just in favor of the Mets. I'm saying it across baseball right now. It's a massive problem that's not going away anywhere. And the league needs to meet with their union and those umps in the offseason and clean up a lot of stuff they've let go on for too long because they are not adequate at their jobs as a whole.
So totally agree in regards to the timeout stuff specifically. It's their choice whether they grant it or not.
Yes.
And like you said, they gave it to San Diego every single time, multiple times in at bat. And it'd be different if, Chris Bassett was standing there for 45 seconds waiting to throw a pitch and he was just standing there like this, just waiting. I mean, it's a podcast, so I'm pretending my hand's a glove. I don't know. But Chris Bassett wasn't standing there for a minute that warrants. It was just, he threw a strike, I need time. He threw another strike, I need time. They wanted to throw off the pace. The one thing that will change next year is that's one of the new rules. You can only step out once per at bat. So that part will at least change. But the inconsistency with umpires on both sides. I mean, there were, when I was watching Saturday and Sunday's game, there were some calls that went the Mets' way too.
Sure.
So it was pretty inconsistent on the umpire side, and that whole situation with Musgrove, like you said, Buck incited it. The umpires didn't exactly handle it quite right.
It took
Like
forever.
Buck asked that the crew chief should go. You get the crew together. You go. Buck wants to do this. Should we check him or no? Yes or no. Not. There doesn't need to be a whole back and forth. You go. You check them, and then you just say, "All right, we're good," and you move on. I don't know why they met again after that. It was definitely a weird situation, and yeah, it really kind of left a bad taste in my mouth about a game that already stunk enough as it was.
All right, let's get into the mailbag. I want to get to a couple of these today. The first one, we'll stay on the Buck topic here, from Sam Newman, who said, as much as we like Buck, is it fair to ask if this is as good as it gets with him? The team was clearly passing over the last 5 weeks, and his track record has a lot of exits like this one. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, it's distinctly possible. I mean, winning 101 baseball games in a season is very difficult. Buck has managed forever. Like we talk about all the time, how he knows more about, or he forgot more about baseball than we'll ever know. He's been managing since the 90s. This is the most wins Buck has ever had in a season as a manager. So it's a very distinct possibility that this is the best we get as far as regular season results go. I don't know how much I look at this weekend and think that's on Buck, that things didn't work out. I thought the handling of Edwin Diaz was a little peculiar on Saturday. I thought that was definitely a weird thing, but ultimately it didn't play much role at all in how this series played out. So is it the best we're going to get? Who knows? I think Buck signed a 3-year deal, so at least you got a couple more years with Buck as manager, and maybe they win 95 games next year, which is still fantastic. But I think there's a reasonable chance this is the most regular season wins you'll see with Buck as the Mets manager, and you just hope that there's another opportunity to get into the playoffs, get in the dance, and just take your shot. Because look, as painful as it feels right now, as much as it sucks, give me the stress and disappointment of losing a playoff series over talking about the prospects that they traded veterans for in July en route to a 75-win season. Just give me that all day, I guess.
I think it's Buck's job to get them to this point, right? And they didn't do enough to win the division. They came up they got as close as you possibly could to winning the division. In a lot of divisions, they would have been the winners and moved on and had that seed that kept them out of the wild card. But as for the playoffs, I think it's hard to look at Buck when your guy that started game 1 gave you nothing. Your big time players outside of game 2 didn't show up, and you look across the way. You don't have to look far. How much production did the Padres get out of Trent Grisham hitting 8th? What did they get out of their number 3 starter, Joe Musgrove, right? It just goes back to, Austin Nola had a big hit. Like, they got production out of spots in their lineup and in their rotation that the Mets simply could not have. And that's not a Buck Showalter issue. That is, you could be mad at a game or two that cost the Mets from having to put them in the wild card round, but what they did in the postseason, to me, is not really about Buck. So he'll get another crack at it next year, and he'll have a chance to put away the narratives of the early postseason exit, and this will be a team that's hungry to do so. All right, the next one from BK Fan 09 said to you, Joe, Mets need to do a better job with player development. Braves are signing top prospects to contracts left and center, and that leaves them with a lot of money to fill in the holes in the free agent market. So I included this one in here because, and I want to know if you agree or disagree, Joe. I see this conversation a lot, and I get it when it's the team that you lost the division to and a team that's had a good grip on the division for a couple years now and recently won a World Series. I think it's really unfair to constantly put the Mets with the Braves and the Dodgers with how little time this ownership group has had to turn those teams into the Braves and the Dodgers. They're on totally different timelines. The Mets have actually accelerated. I can't say it enough. 77 wins to 101, no matter what the postseason exit was. The Mets' goal is to get there, to draft and sign international free agents, develop them, and keep them on very modest deals for a long time. This group has not had that opportunity. When they bought the team, that opportunity was pretty much almost out the door with guys like Pete Alonso and things along that line. So I think it's a good point to bring up as a comparison. It's a bad one to criticize them for.
Yeah, we can't be criticizing the Mets player development right now. Obviously, if you go back to how it was prior to Steve Cohen taking over, it was just a different time in how things were run around here. And Steve Cohen is dumping money into not just the front office, not just the on-field product that you see every day at Citi Field. He dumped big money into analytics and research and development. That is going to transition over into the amateur side. They now had analysts working with the amateur draft group, which is led by Tommy Tanis, and by all accounts, they had a fantastic draft for the 2022 draft. I believe MLB Pipeline ranked them as the top draft in the class, in the sport. So, I mean, they had 2 first-round picks, so that helps. But either way, you can also mess up 2 first-round picks. So we believe that they have, I believe personally, that they have the right scouting presence in place. Player development, I think, is next on the list. And it takes time. It truly does. Rome was not built in a day. And the Braves player development system has kind of been largely intact for years and years now. The Dodgers, years and years. Like, they're trying. The Mets are trying to play catch up. There's no question about it. And I think they're catching up in ways quicker than maybe even I expected, with the investments that they're doing down in the pitching lab that's coming in Port St. Lucie, and everything they're doing on the hitting side. I mean, Colin Hetzler won the staff of the year, and he's a guy that Brett Beatty credits with changing his swing and tapping into more power, making Brett Beatty into the major leaguer. Francisco Alvarez has credited him through the back channels that I've heard. Like, he's a guy that the Mets are high on as a staff. So I think player development takes time. And, there was years here that the Mets were doing nothing but trade prospects for pieces. And while we can focus on the Jared Kelnicks and the big names, sometimes it's the Felix Valerios, it's the Endy Rodriguez, it's those guys that are getting moved for smaller pieces, and that just kind of needs that you need to calm down a little bit on that and flex Steve Cohen's wallet in free agency where you can. Don't burn these prospects, and then continue to invest in player development, which I think you're going to see. You're going to see a lot of that this offseason. There's going to be a lot of things that come out about who's doing different roles in player development, and I think they will get there. I see no reason to doubt that they will. It just, unfortunately, player development is one thing you can't turn over overnight. You could turn over a major league roster by spending $300 million. Boom, look, you're a contender for right then and there. But player development is a long-term investment that takes time. They're going to get there.
There's so many questions in the mailbag here, and a lot of them were actually really positive. A lot of people wrote how much they enjoyed this season, and they'll get over this and look forward to being back at opening day. And I think that's something that Joe and I can side with even throughout our frustrations. Joe, there's about 90 questions about DeGrom. I think we are at the point where we are just going to do a DeGrom episode, so I don't want people to think we're ignoring those. But one I did want to get in here was from Kevin. He said, why didn't the Mets copy the Padres' delay tactics on Musgrove? It's something I thought about when the Padres started to do it, because the Mets have, their 3 frontline starters. They're inseparable in the dugout. They obviously operate in very similar ways. They're guys that get into rhythm. Bassett notoriously is one of the slowest guys overall in between pitches in the league, and that'll change with the pitch clock. But DeGrom and Scherzer, when Scherzer gets going, Scherzer likes to get the ball back and throw it right back over and over again. You have a guy like Darvish, who said he was a little rattled early on by how loud it was. Obviously, they got to Snell, who just looked miserable out there. Musgrove was the one guy it never looked like they had a chance against. And I know they got blown out game 1, but you and I were there. It felt like there was a lot of times where they were about to really crank things up against Darvish, and they just couldn't do it. But he was really struggling in between pitches out there. Why do you think they didn't do anything to Musgrove until the ear check in the 6th inning?
That's a good question. I don't know. It
You're just
feels
so
like
in the moment, and
yeah.
yeah,
I wonder if it's just you wonder too about the hitter's comfort because
yeah,
Francisco Lindor has made it abundantly clear he hates stepping out. He wants to stay in the box. So it could have been a comfort thing. Like I don't know. And would it have made a difference? I don't know, right? Like if they just kept stepping out. I mean, I guess in theory it could have. It clearly frustrated Bassett on Sunday that San Diego was doing that, and that's one of those kind of unanswerable ones. I think that I'm not sure exactly why, but my brain just says like maybe it was a comfort thing for the Mets where there are guys that stay in the box, and I mean evidenced by their willingness to get hit by pitch. Like they're not stepping out and playing games; they're going to stay in there, and even if the ball's coming at them, they're going to stay in there. So that's kind of my best answer, but it's a valid question that I don't know. I mean, I assume Buck was asked, but I frankly didn't want to listen to the press conferences. After the losses, the press conferences weren't for me, so I'm not sure if he touched on it, but yeah, something that they could have considered, but not sure why they didn't.
All right, the last one here, and then we'll get to closing thoughts. Just a quick one here. Tyler Smith threw in the idea of moving McCann with a prospect in hopes of freeing up payroll. Do you think that's something the Mets are even going to have to entertain this offseason, Joe, or do you think they just floor it with the money and figure out that part later?
I didn't know the Cowboys starting left tackle. Huge Mets fan and huge fan of the Mets pod. Much appreciated, Tyler. But as far as James McCann goes, I think it feels like his time is up here, one way or another. I would preferably call around the teams and say, how much money do I need to pitch in of James McCann's contract for you to take him and, you change of scenery, he's your guy, and I could throw Francisco Alvarez into the lineup, or something that you and I talked about earlier was, maybe the idea of swapping for a bad contract. I'd have to look around to see who was kind of like a bad reliever that has 2 years and $15 million left or something like that, some level of financial offset that can maybe a change of scenery for both the reliever and for McCann. But it feels like it would be pretty surprising if we saw James McCann, I think, on the 2023 Mets.
Patrick Corbin for James McCann. You heard it here first. No,
oh, no.
I'm just
no.
It's not going to be like that.
Yeah.
All right. A reminder to everybody, we have a lot to do here. It's going to be a crazy time for the Mets. It's really going to be nuts. I mean, there's going to be big trades with this team. There's going to be an active free agency again. There's a lot of internal free agents that will either be retained and plenty of them will walk. And we are going to talk so much about Jacob deGrom, of course, until he's either a Met for life or until he's pitching somewhere else. So we'll also have some great guests on the show in the offseason and a few other special surprises to come. So stay with us here. But Joe, closing thoughts is I promise this will be our saddest show of the year. After this, we go back to doing truthfully what you and I do best. We awaken here in the offseason, it feels like every year.
There's nothing like team building. But yeah, disappointing weekend, and I hope this resonated with all of you. But I'm looking forward to what we're going to do because, like you said, this show is not going anywhere. We're going to keep coming to you once a week throughout the whole off season. We're going to cover rumors, trades that happen, free agent signings that happen. Like, we're not going anywhere. So make sure you stay tuned with us, and the free agent list. We're gonna really dive into it, but I mean it's daunting when you look at it how much different this Mets team is gonna look, and I look forward to having some back and forths about who they should consider, and yeah, it's a tough time, and tough times happen. You got to get past them, and I think the Mets are prepared to do that. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our friend Sarah Langs, who obviously announced that she's dealing with ALS, and obviously we wish nothing but best for Sarah. She does a lot of stuff with SNY, and she does a lot of stuff to help out basically everyone, it feels like.
Great for baseball. Truly great for baseball.
She's fantastic for baseball, and by all accounts, I've yet to have the pleasure to meet Sarah, but by all accounts, the way that she is being talked about amongst everybody over the last couple of days, and the way that everyone is behind her, yeah, it's definitely great to see, and we're certainly behind Sarah as she goes through this fight with ALS.
And well done by the Mets on Friday night for recognizing Sarah and the battle she's dealing with. And as we wrap up this episode, if you're a Mets fan and you've made it this far, you've been through years of baseball not really mattering once June started, and off seasons of no news and no significant efforts to try to get better, and always hoping on the players in the minors turning into stars and then worrying about when it's time to get paid them leaving. If you've made it this far, you can deal with a 101 season coming to a really, really disappointing ending, but with a lot of promise in the future. And I know there's a lot of people that don't want to hear that right now, and that's okay. As soon as the final out was made, I shut off my TV and said, I'm not talking about the Mets, no matter who texts me, until it's time to do the podcast. And I will love talking about the Mets all over the offseason all again, but I understand why some people will struggle with closure on this season. But there is so much still somehow to be excited about with this franchise as a whole for the future. And we thank everybody for joining us in being part of that ride. So a reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast. Truly, thank you so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.